before we begin, I should mention that last night someone came up and told me that the presentation was noticeably shorter than the other presentations. And I was trying to think about why that might be true. And I have come to the conclusion there's always more to say about what you do than about what you don't do. So fasting is about what you don't do. And so there's less to say about it. A few words about fasting in general. There are very few practices that are universal to religion. You know that there are many Eastern religions in which prayer is not a part of the religion at all. And the idea it's an all-knowing, all-loving God. He knows you, he knows what you need, and he knows what he's going to do. So prayer is not a part of it. But there is no religion I know of where fasting is not one of the elements. It was part of the pagan religions as well. Fasting is universal with regards to religion. And it has many, many different forms and many different purposes. One of the major purposes that we see of fasting, and this is most particularly in the East, is asceticism. It's a way of living a very ascetic life. And if you would look at the great monasteries of Europe, and if you would take something like the Camaldolese, let's say in California, you know, the Camaldolese, I think, observe 5 days a year that are not fast days. And of course, no Sunday is a fast day. But other than that, there are only 5 days a year that are days they don't fast. I used to have a standing joke with one of the monks because of the involvement of services and everything. It used to make me most happy when a feast day occurred on a Sunday, because then there was the one Mass for the whole thing, you know. And it made him totally miserable, because then they missed one of their feast days, because it fell on the Sunday as well. So asceticism is one of the major forces that will motivate the whole idea of fasting. Another one is purification. And you find this, again, in religions. A lot of Eastern religions see it as a form of purifying the body. And you would find this, you know, a lot of health advocates bring this sort of thing up. And it's also a basic element in medicine, if you go into Chinese medicine, that fasting becomes one of the elements of purifying the body with regards to the whole thing. There's also many cultures where fasting becomes a part of the mourning process. When I began to encounter this, I encountered it first of all in Hawaii, and I thought it was kind of funny because the basic Hawaiian thing about mourning, the way they would mourn a person, was to fast. And historically, they don't do it anymore, but historically they would inflict physical injury on themselves with rocks. But they would fast and inflict physical injury. And the essential thing, I think you know most Christians, is we have a funeral with a party. And oftentimes I thought it was amusing to watch these Hawaiian Catholics who would be in a period of fasting except for the meal after the burial. You know, they would make a concession to the Catholics, and we all had a feast, and then they would go back to their fasting. But for many cultures, non-Christian and non-Jewish, I should point out, mourning is also a period of fasting. And the final one, and you find this more in paganism than anywhere else, is that fasting was a way of supplication to the gods. You would give up certain things, and then God would grant you certain things. You know, when I was a youngster, you heard a lot of that in Roman Catholicism. It was never official teaching. It's never been a part of the teaching of our church. But the idea is if you give up this, that somehow God responds. And so that's one of the ways of the things. The purpose seems to indicate the form that fasting will take. And I'll talk about the different purposes. But I'll give you an example of one. Fasting for the Muslims is a thing of discipline. So the form of fasting for them is from sunrise to sunset, you eat and drink nothing, not even water. Okay? And that's because all they're really interested in is the discipline aspect of it. And then in the evening, you'd have the feast and everything. In the Christian church, our fasting is really aimed at helping other people. And so we're supposed to limit the amount we eat. Not that we're supposed to be so disciplined about not eating, but we limit the amount we eat so that we have more to give to people who have less. It's a very different way. But the purpose of fasting will very, very often dictate kind of how it goes. So I'd like to look at the first one. The first one has to do with fasting is very often joined with prayer. And this is a very powerful theme you find in the scriptures. If you look at Jesus or Moses or Elijah or Jeremiah, you'll notice they all began their ministry with a period of fasting. Like the 40 days in the desert for Jesus were a period of fast. And the principal purpose of this is clarity of the mind. One of the strange things that goes on in a human being is that the bulk of our energy and effort is used in the digestion and processing of food. And to the degree you and I are eating less and processing less, our minds and things are clearer to concentrate on other things. I'll tell you one caution of this. If you're fasting to the point where the only thing you're thinking about is food, you've gone too far, okay? Once that happens, then there's not the purification thing. But one of the things to note when you begin to study this, it is an amazing thing to me how often really powerful people in any field do an immense amount of fasting, and sometimes unknowingly. An example, I would take the example of Albert Einstein, for instance. Einstein, in several of the articles about him, you begin to find out that periodically his wife would have to break into his office and sort of force feed him. And was he fasting? Well, if you would ask him, he would say no. But the thing is, he wasn't eating. And why was that? He was so deep into what he was doing, the work he was doing. But the effect of it was it cleared his mind and brought him deeper into it. If you study the philosophers, the great philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, fasting was a big part of their lives. And again, it wasn't that they decided they were going to give up food. It's decided they were so interested in what they were doing, they didn't have time to eat. And I probably have shared this with you before, but my favorite is artists, and particularly Michelangelo. Michelangelo would get so involved in a painting, and probably the best example is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He poisoned himself 4 times during the what do you call it, the ceiling. The way the ceiling is done is a fresco. You put on wet plaster, and you have to get it painted before it dries. And you have to do it in sections, and that way the paint permeates the plaster. It's not on the surface, it is actually into the plaster. Well, in this process, as you imagine, you put up the piece of plaster in sections, and then you need to paint it. And he just loved doing it. So he'd get started, and then you just have to stay there till it gets done. And the way he poisoned himself was he, at certain times, wouldn't come down the scaffolding when he was thirsty and ended up drinking the water he was washing his brushes in. And so, he just poisoned himself. So this idea of fasting, if you study great people, if you ever get a biography or autobiography of a very significant, person in one of these fields, you would be amazed at the amount of fasting, although they never knew, nor did they ever intend to fast. But the fasting becomes one of the major increments of the clarity of their mind. That's also why they use it with regards to prayer. Remember, the whole thing of prayer is to be able to listen to God, to be able to hear God. And this listening and hearing becomes clearer and clearer in 2 things. Number 1 is the fasting, because you're eating less. And the second thing is they would go into areas of sensual deprivation, a desert, where there isn't that much to look at. And they would go into this, the idea that it would alert them and make them a lot more given to the prayer they were about and clarified their mind in understanding the prayer. Also, in the whole thing of prayer, many authors, if you study like Benedict and stuff like this, they consider fasting an act of humility, okay? And I mention that because they mention it in their writings. I don't understand how it's an act of humility, but they see it as an act of humility as part of the thing. So that is the way fasting is seen in prayer, and I would say that's one of the major elements of it when you look in the Jewish scriptures. It is to do that. The Muslim experience, again, is that fasting is a thing of control. And if you have ever known someone like with an addiction, alcohol or something like that, you know that one of the good ways to get a person like that to start with something like Alcoholics Anonymous, the great sense that addicts have is that their life is out of control. That is the very thing of addiction. It is beyond your control. And sometimes one of the steps to getting people out of the addiction thing is to get them to turn away from the thing they're addicted to entirely. I mean, don't deal with that. And find any other area of their life where they can give up something, like fasting or something like that, because it gives them a sense that they can actually control something. And once they have the sense that they actually can control something, then they can pull that sense of control into alcoholism, drugs, and these sort of things. And again, if you look at something like Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the best known, it is control to the maximum with regards to the alcoholism. But it's easier to get into the control by starting something else, because most addicts I've encountered do not believe they have any control over their lives at all. And that sense of not having any control just leaves it all free. So in the Muslim tradition, they have their fast, and their fast is once a year. It's Ramadan. I don't know, I'm not really sure the kind of calendar the Muslims work on, but the Muslim calendar does not allow for something like leap year. So each year, Ramadan is earlier, and that's been going on for years. Like, we have an adjustment in our calendar, and the Jews use a lunar calendar, but there's an adjustment in the lunar calendar. We use a solar one. They use a lunar one. I'm not really sure the calendar that the Muslims work on, but I do know it advances every single year. I was one time on an airline flying from Australia to San Francisco, and we stopped in Fiji and switched there to the Fijian airline. And according to the Muslim tradition, you cannot eat from sunrise to sunset. And unfortunately, the plane was going the wrong direction. And so we never hit sunset on the entire flight. And they would not serve food or water. They wouldn't serve anything. Now, if you wanted water, you could get up and go back and get water yourself, but they would not serve food or water. And what they do, they fast during the entire daylight period, and that is a thing of basically an exercise of control. And they go through that, short period. The fasting that we experience in Christianity is not so much the clarity of mind that we talk about in the prayer thing in the Jewish tradition, and it is not so much the idea of control as we see in the Muslim tradition, as it is charity. The very basis of fasting within our tradition is the ability to share food with others. And remember, I told you the Muslim goes from sunrise to sunset. Well, if you look very carefully at the laws that we have as fasting, well, we say what you're supposed to do when you fast is that you're supposed to have one main meal a day, and the other 2 meals are not to equal that. Well, the presumption is that you eat 3 meals a day, and you give 1 to the poor, and take 1 of the other meals and divide it in half for the 2. And if any of you have ever seen any of these programs like we oftentimes use during Lent, things like the rice bowl program, where they put it looks like a little rice bowl out of cardboard on your table and you're supposed to put money in it each day, the presumption is that is the money saved by eating less food. It isn't just the idea of the donation. From our tradition, fasting is supposed to be something that is given away, not really something that is just, deprived. If you think about it, anytime you give anything to someone, you've given up something. And so this idea that our fasting is actually the result of what we do in the service of other people. And that's how fasting was seen in the Christian community. Having said that, once a person actually begins to go into the process of fasting, you understand that all of these things are present. So a person who decides to fast, if I want to, I can make charity an aspect of the fasting. Automatically, there's some discipline connected with the fasting. And automatically, there is this clarity connected with the fasting. And so this becomes basically the package of fasting in a religious element. That when we set about fasting, to use it in conjunction with prayer and this sort of thing, as the Jews do for the triad, but to use it in conjunction with that and simultaneously be able to give to the poor. And when you see that, you see how the prayer, fasting, and almsgiving actually are woven together. They're intertwined. They are not supposed to be independently of one another. There's a famous book, and I think it's in the library. It's the big gallery in St. Petersburg, but they have a book there of Jewish religious practices, and the front page of the book is actually a braid that goes around it, and the braid actually represents the three things, which is prayer, almsgiving, and fasting, which are braided together in this thing that circles the book. And that is the basis of how they come to the holiness in the presence of God. So basically, that's what fasting is about. And in our tradition, the main thing to understand is that the initial purpose of fasting is the care of another person. And a lot of authors will take fasting long beyond food. They mention that in today's world, probably the thing that you and I most treasure in our world is actually time. And to give up time to others is in fact a form of fasting. To give up energy and effort with regards to others. This is all forms of fasting. But to understand fasting being a part of our life. The Church at the Second Vatican Council came to the realization that fasting, as we put together for ourselves, is really not that serious a thing. Like, for instance, if you remember, the official thing was, as I told you, about the 3 meals, and that you couldn't eat anything between meals. When you look at that, you also realize that all students were exempt. Okay? So students are automatically exempted for any kind of fasting. So what does that put you up in your 20s by the time you have to fast anyway? And they noticed that over a certain age, most people have to control what they eat. That has nothing to do with fasting. It has to do with medical things. It has to do with weight. It has to do... But when you look at that single thing about the 2 meals not equaling the third, I think most of us eat that way every day. I mean, that's hardly a thing of fasting. The other aspect of fasting that we had was the abstinence. Now, abstinence, the idea of giving up meat, I'm sure was a very significant thing if you lived inland and lived about 200 years ago. But today, you can have fresh fish anywhere in the world, anytime. And so the idea of giving up meat is basically a non-thing. So one of the things the Church did in the Second Vatican Council was really relax the ideas of fasting. Again, those of you who are my age or older will remember you used to fast all of Lent except the Sundays. And I think it was Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were all days of abstinence too. You would fast and then you had 3 days of abstinence through the whole season. But they came to realize that wasn't really a discipline for most people. And so one of the things that has happened is the relaxation of that. But with the relaxation is the weight upon you and I to find a discipline for Lent. Each one of us is supposed to find some kind of a discipline for Lent. Same thing for Fridays. You and I are each supposed to find a personal discipline for Fridays, something that will actually be a discipline for us. Obviously in this area, giving up meat. Some people have done it for years and don't realize it's a penance, you know. So the idea here is to try and do some penance. Thank you very much. Anyone have any questions before we go? Go ahead.